You can also, of course, say a couple of words about yourselves, just so people know who you are, since we're not going to be doing full introductions for each person. So I hope that makes sense. And as I think you know, I'll be also changing the slides for everyone. So if I'm not doing it correctly, please just say change slide or next slide or whatever. Don't hesitate. And then I think we're saving questions for the end. But Eileen is going to be the one sort of gathering up the questions and sharing them with everyone at the end, the Q&A. So I think that is our situation there. So I got automatically switched to speaker view. Okay, now I'm back to
Allegra.
yes.
I'm switching my own slides, right? Are you switching them?
No, I am.
Oh,
yeah.
okay.
So we don't have to, so we can have a smooth transition. So you will see that I did change the template slightly, but everything else is absolutely.
So you're going to share the screen with my presentation, not me share the screen with my presentation.
That's correct.
Okay.
They're full service, Sarah.
I got it. I didn't realize. I'm glad you said something.
Good.
We want to make it easy. We want to make it easy for you. And frankly, most people don't trust me to change slides fast enough. So,
well, Peter, if it makes you feel any better, I got a tutorial yesterday, so I made sure I'm going to mess it up. But now Allegra will make sure I don't mess it up.
No, you know, Allegra's a pro at this, so.
Well, famous last words. Fingers crossed. Fingers crossed. It's complex presentation today, so that's why we asked for the slides in advance to kind of combine them all into one. So we're not switching the control of the share screen back and forth, since there are so many different speakers today.
So my assumption was like 5 or 10 minutes.
Right.
Okay.
I'm going to admit people at 5 o'clock. We're not going to actually start till 5:01 or 2. Start with Allegra on that. She can decide exactly how it's going. You look at the participant number. If it's going up still rapidly, I think we can delay another minute. But it's hopefully we don't want to penalize people for being on time. So I'm going to. We're ready to admit everybody.
Yep.
Yeah, and just I'm going to manage the chat and direct Q&A. If it doesn't name one of the speakers, I guess if it's a state, I'll direct it to the speaker who talked about that state. But I guess I'm asking, I'll just leave it open if people want to weigh in. So.
Yeah, I think with the chat function, the name on their screen is the name that will appear in the chat. So
yeah, no, but if it's a question that they don't direct it to a speaker, like, you know, who should answer since there's, but we'll figure it out.
We'll figure it out. I mean, don't worry.
Yeah, it should be pretty clear. Play it by ear.
Yeah, that's up to
I'm
you.
admitting all now to just 12.
We can always ask Peter.
I'm going to put everyone on mute initially if they're not on that already, just to make it easier. And they can unmute as appropriate. If I can find that command.
So hello, everyone, and good evening. Welcome to tonight's presentation from Reform Elections Now. My name is Allegra Klein, and our topic today is state-by-state actions to reform our political system. Those of you who have attended our presentations in the past may have noticed that our topics usually addressed nationwide issues. What is being done to promote election reform at the national level? Last year, we were pleased to support the passage of ECRA, the Electoral College Reform Act, which flew in under the radar at the last moment as part of the huge omnibus package that was signed into law at the end of December. This is the first bill to update the Electoral Count Act since 1887, and it was meant to help avoid a repeat of the events of January 6, 2021. Reform Elections Now have been working on January 6th issues since the summer of 2020. This year, however, Reform Elections Now is shifting gears from a focus on national reform to recognize major opportunities on the state level. Tonight, we will start by looking at 4 states: Arizona, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, and Virginia. Our Director of Research, Peter Cyrus, will give an overview of various voting systems across the country, and then each presenter will discuss election reform in their state. Rather than introducing them all now, I will ask that each of them do that at the beginning of their presentations. One last note. If you are new to Reform Elections Now and are interested in hearing about future presentations, please go to our website at reformelectionsnow.org and sign up for our mailing list. Thank you again for joining us tonight, and over to you, Peter.
Thanks, Allegra. I got to figure out how to unmute myself. So today we're going to, as Allegra said, we're going to talk about state-by-state actions to reform elections in 4 states. Now, the problem is most elections are uncompetitive. One party dominates, whether by reason of where people live or gerrymandering. And just so you understand, the dominant party gerrymanders not just against the other party, but also against leaders of its own party it doesn't like. Just ask Barack Obama and Hakeem Jeffries, both of whom were gerrymandered by their own parties from running. Now, in the election system, primaries are often effectively the final election. Often independents are blocked from participating in primaries, and both parties tend to nominate candidates that focus on their bases, reducing opportunities for moderates and increasing extremism. This leads to very low turnout, sometimes as low as 1% to 2%, and moderates get primaried into retirement, and partisanship rules, while moderates and bipartisanship have almost disappeared. Now, next. Can we go next? No, I think, yeah. And just look at the decline of competitive races in swing states over time. I'm not going to say anything. All you have to do is look at this picture. And especially if you look on the right at the incredible shrinking swing state, you see it's gone from 154 to 72 in, the last 30 years. Next. Now, our goal is to create competitive elections with more moderation, increased bipartisanship, and more effective government. Now, to do this, there are 5 simple steps. Eliminate gerrymandering by having independent commissions, adopt voting systems like top 2 nonpartisan primaries, ranked choice voting primaries, things like that, that encourage moderation and cooperation, change final election rules to do the same, consider new voting systems, and make voting more accessible so people can vote, and less questionable so fewer people will question the results. Next. Now, let's just look. These are election districts drawn by stone politicians. It's possible that the politicians were, they didn't have to be using weed. They could have been using mushrooms and stuff. But these are or were real districts. Okay, next. Now, the first way to deal with gerrymandering is to have independent commissions with Republican, Democratic, and independent members, because these people tend to draw boundaries that lead to more competitive and less partisan elections. Next. Now, the second point we made was about primaries, because as we noted, primaries are often the major the only election. So the ways we see to solve the primary problems are to eliminate closed and semi-closed primaries. In many states like New York, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, Florida, Oregon, and others, if they had open primaries, more moderate candidates would be nominated and elected, and independents wouldn't be deprived of their right to vote. We also have looked at we also like top two primaries, which they use in California, Washington, Louisiana, and Nebraska, and ranked choice voting. Next. Now, changing the rules of the final election in the top two nonpartisan system, you often have moderates winning the final election, especially if two members of the same party are competing against each other. Ranked choice voting similarly promotes multiple points of view, less negative campaigning, more cooperation in the election, and more moderates. They're different systems. We'll hear about some of them today. Next. We also, some states are exploring new voting systems like approval voting, where people vote for any candidate for whom they approve, Condorcet voting, plus minus voting, where you get a plus vote and a minus vote, and the one with the highest one wins, multi-member districts. Next. And finally, we think that we need to make voting more accessible and more secure, focusing on easing steps to registration, providing periods of early voting, providing more opportunities for mail-in voting, and providing citizens with voter ID linked to a national registry to limit disputes over voter identification. Next. Now, how can these kinds of change be implemented? Because change sounds good. How do we do it? Well, it's really two models. What I call the trigger model, where some major event occurs that convinces everybody in the state to change, or the incremental model, which is piece by piece by piece. Next. Now, the trigger model requires an event that unifies parts of both parties to create change. In Maine, both parties dislike Governor LePage, who won with 35% of the vote. In Alaska, Lisa Murkowski lost a Republican primary to a Tea Party candidate and ran as a write-in because of the sore loser law. So after that election, Republicans joined in approving top four ranked choice voting. These kind of things, and you've seen similar things in California and Nevada, these kind of things get people to act. The problem is that it's like an earthquake. It has a big effect, but you can't time it. Next. The incremental model, states implement reforms at the primary or local level to give voters experience with new systems. Some states have created independent commissions for redistricting, open primaries, or provided increased early and mail-in voting. Some localities, like cities, even congressional districts, have implemented ranked choice voting or other new voting systems, giving voters direct experience. Some states have implemented new systems in primaries for presidential nominations and for statewide nominations. For example, in Virginia, Republicans used ranked choice voting to nominate Glenn Youngkin for governor, who then flipped to state Republican. Next. There are, however, two forces strongly resistant to change. They're called the Democratic and Republican parties. These two parties have spent 169 years building their duopoly. They like controlling elections and candidates who support their bases. They do not like bipartisanship and steadfastly oppose anything that could challenge their control. Just ask Adam Kinzinger. When he voted to impeach Trump, Republicans threw him out of their caucus, and Democrats gerrymandered him into retirement. That shows you what happens if you try to be in the middle somewhere. The parties put up a strong resistance, anything threatening their duopoly. Next. Now, in tonight's meeting, we're going to hear from people from various states who are focused on electoral reform. Each person will describe the conditions in their state, the challenges, and the progress to date. And after the state presentations, we're going to have a Q&A session. We're going to lead off tonight with Sarah Smallhouse from Arizona. Sarah, who will be, oh, you skipped my introduction of Sarah. So this is Sarah's bio. We'll come back to the bios for the next people. And I'll now turn it over to Sarah to introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Peter, for inviting me to present on this webinar. We have been focused on our elections for some time. What I have up here on the screen right now is from 2022, and it illustrates a lot of the points you just made. We have publicly funded, semi-closed party-run primaries where independents barely participate, and frankly, the fraction of the general electorate is also very low, 13% of Republicans and 10% of Democrats. So not surprisingly, we had the ends of the ideological spectrum frequently won their primary contests. And in the general election, people grumbled. They didn't like the choices that they had. And as you alluded to, often the effective final vote is in the primary. In Arizona, 83% of legislative districts lean heavily red or blue. And really the outcome is decided in the primary for that reason. So, and you know, if it's not a foregone conclusion, what we had was incumbent legislators being retired by more ideologically extreme people. So currently, I mean, Arizona has a reputation for being, you know, well, I guess purple now, but leaning red. But 34% of registered voters in our state now are independents or party not disclosed. And there's much more of a mix than is often attributed to Arizona. Okay, next slide. So that is a profile of who our voters are, pretty much 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. However, nearly 80% of the races, people won by a margin of 10% or more, meaning they were not competitive. So this is fundamentally minority rule, and that's the base of the problem in our view. Next slide. So this slide, you'll scroll through the points, but people are very upset. There's an organization in Arizona called the Center for the Future of Arizona, and they do a Gallup poll on opinions people have about our state every 10 years, and then smaller polls intermittently. And these numbers are coming from that, and they illustrate exactly what the problem is. Most voters think we're not headed in the right direction, that our elected officials are not focused on what we care about most, and nearly 70% do not believe politicians are delivering the results we want, need, and deserve. And so there's an appetite for change. Next slide. So this is what we have landed on. And for many of you on the call, I'm sure you're familiar with the Politics Industry, written by Catherine Gale and Michael Porter. It's been a very influential book. And we, as I said earlier, have been working on primary reform for over 10 years. We tried twice for top two, and for reasons it's not worth going into. those efforts were not successful. So we are going at it again, and there was a lot of debate over whether top two or ranked choice voting in the general election made more sense for Arizona. And the consensus has really been that the top two idea has sort of gone stale in Arizona, and a lot of people came out negative on it. But conversely, ranked choice voting is gaining momentum. And it seems to be a new idea that people are willing to think about and consider. The fact that all voters and all candidates would be treated equally, and that this is conducive to new ideas and less negative campaigning and basic good governance is very appealing. So we are on the verge of submitting starting a campaign. Well, next slide. What we are aiming at is a citizens initiative in 2024. And we are congealing around this basic idea. Right now, it's grass tops and grassroots organizing. We have formed a 501c3 that has been trying to raise awareness around what the primary problem is and what we can do about it. We've also formed a C4 to get ready for our campaign. We're just on the cusp of finalizing the initiative language. And we expect to start collecting signatures this summer. Because this will be a constitutional reform, it's a very high bar. It'll take 385,000 signatures, good, valid signatures, to make the ballot. And that's a lot of signatures for Arizona. It's going to be a slog. But we are really locking arms with other organizations in the state, like the League of Women Voters, like Voter Choice Arizona, to synergize, to make all our efforts add up to something. I don't think we can win if we fracture. So we're in that process. Next slide. And the two principal organizations are Save Democracy Arizona, of which I am the president, and Voter Choice Arizona, of which Blake Saka has been leading. And they have just had tremendous grassroots progress. Whereas Save Democracy has been very focused on trying to get a grass tops initiative and funding going for this. So when we combine our forces, we're significant. And, in every state, I think it's a fair statement that both the Republicans and the Democrats are skeptical of this, because it's a real shift in power away from the parties. But in Arizona, I will say that it is, there are more Republicans who are skeptical of this. And they are organizing. Some of our Republican legislators are trying to preemptively outlaw ranked choice voting as a bad scheme. I don't think their bill will get through, but there's starting to be some real stir around what we're doing. And we take that as strong encouragement. So in a nutshell, that's what's happening in Arizona, and I'll be happy to take questions at the end when appropriate.
Thank you, Sarah. Next up, we have Christopher Piros, and I will allow him to introduce himself. Is Christopher on the call? Chris? Okay, I think we're having technical.
Unmute myself. Hello, everybody. I am Chris Piros. I'm one of the sort of core members of Reform Elections Now, and I do live in Pennsylvania. So I'm going to touch on 7 topics briefly related to the electoral situation in Pennsylvania. Turn the slide. First, we're Allegra, can you turn it? Let me talk about sort of the lay of the land in Pennsylvania. And the chart on the right, or map on the right, really says a lot about the state. You look at that, you'll see that it really resembles, in some respects, the nation. There's an urban-rural divide. The concentration of population represented by the size of the districts, you can see, concentrated in the southeast and in the west. There's also a red-blue divide, with blue on the coast, so to speak, and red in the middle. If you look at the chart on the lower left, you can see that office holders are really pretty evenly split in the state, despite the big dispersion in the party representation in different parts of the state. And from the map, you would think that that Republicans were dominant, but obviously not so. The governor recently elected Shapiro is a Democrat. Both of our senators, the U.S. senators, are Democrats, but we had a Republican senator who just retired. Our U.S. House delegation is split 9-8, so you don't get closer than that. Our state's Senate, it has a Republican majority. Our state House has a Democratic majority of just 1 seat at this point. The Supreme Court has a Democratic majority, and yes, the courts are elected in Pennsylvania. I think it's interesting to focus for a minute on the state house representation, because the Democrats, although they have a majority now, as of the 2022 election, they were in the minority for most of the last 27 years. But also the other thing that I think is very interesting is the concentration of power in the southeastern region of the state, i.e. Philadelphia and its suburbs. All 3 of the top Democrats in the House, including the Speaker, are from that region. 56 of the 21 Democratic representatives in the House are from that region, and half of the committee chairs in the House are from that region. I should also add that Governor Shapiro is from that area too. So there's a lot of political power now concentrated in the Philadelphia area. I might also point out that the blue districts in the middle of the state, that's State College. That's where Penn State is. So that's kind of I guess you could say, the academic lean towards to the Democratic Party. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, in redistricting, excuse me, the Philadelphia Inquirer, I think, sort of, in a sense, said it all. Pennsylvania has a rich history of gerrymandering. I won't go through, the history in any detail, but suffice it to say that both the state and the federal courts have been deeply involved in the redistricting processes in Pennsylvania for a number of years. For the moment, anyway, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court seems to be in control. They essentially dictated the most recent congressional districts and sort of oversaw the redistricting for the US, for the House, Pennsylvania House as well. But I would point out that there is a North Carolina case in front of the US Supreme Court this year where they will be ruling on the extent to which state courts can intervene in the redistricting process when legislatures are in fact supposed to be in charge of that. So stay tuned for that ruling from the US Supreme Court and the potential fallout for what that will mean for redistricting in Pennsylvania. Next slide, please. So what are voters asking for? Well, it was interesting, the interim House Speaker, Mark Rossi, and a bipartisan committee actually did a listening tour earlier this year across the state to hear what was on voters' minds. So I've listed here some of the main topics that came up in the Philadelphia area meeting. First of all, they want open primaries, and we'll be talking about that in a little more detail in a minute. They want redistricting reform, calling for independent commissions. They want campaign finance reform. They want to change the process for constitutional amendments. In particular, they want to be able to initiate constitutional amendments by referendum, which is currently not allowed in Pennsylvania. And I'll talk about the constitutional amendments again in a few minutes. And then they want reforms to the legislative process. Basically, voters are fed up with things not getting done. Very much like in Washington, there's gridlock. And I think one little statistic that came up says a lot, and that is that of the 3,900 bills introduced in the last legislative session, only 8% of them made it through the process and to the governor's desk. So people don't like the way the committees model things up. They don't like the way the committee representation is divided up. They don't want unlimited gifts to legislators, which apparently Pennsylvania does, and is the only state that doesn't like that. Pennsylvania doesn't ban outside jobs for legislators, even though it's a full-time job and pays accordingly. Okay. Next slide. Allegra. There we go. Closed primaries. Pennsylvania at this point has closed primaries. I should point out, I've given a list here of states that have closed primaries, but I should point out that there are different definitions of what's closed, what's open, what's semi-open or closed. So you may see different lists. But at this point, let me introduce and call upon David Thornburg, who's really leading the charge and is the expert on open primaries in Pennsylvania. So I'll let him give you the lowdown rather than talk to my slide here. David, welcome.
Yep. Thank you, Chris. You did a great job setting this up. And I just want to applaud this whole group for focusing on states, because that's where, in the decentralized nature of the U.S. government, that's where all the action is around these issues. Just a quick bit of background. I am a longtime civic leader in Pennsylvania, born and raised in Pittsburgh, lived in Philadelphia for a good while. And if you've been around for a while and you recognize my last name, my dad was, I think, a great governor in Pennsylvania in the late 70s into the mid 80s. So I come by my interest in good governance naturally. Let me just fill you in on this effort, because this is real time, and I think one that has a a good to very good chance of actually coming to fruition this year. I am chairing a campaign called Ballot PA, so the website ballotpa.org if you want to go look at it, which is simply trying to end closed primaries in Pennsylvania and allow our 1.1 million independent voters the chance to participate in those elections. This is the simplest form of participation, which would simply allow them to choose a party primary in which to participate. It's similar to what's in place. They're all a little different, but in place in have been for a long time in places like Massachusetts or New Hampshire or Colorado or North Carolina. You may think, well, this is a fairly incremental approach, but one important line of demarcation among states is that some states allow ballot initiatives like Arizona, and some states you have to work a process like this through the legislature. So we do not have ballot initiatives in Pennsylvania, so we've got to climb the long and tough hill to get this done in the legislature. We need a positive vote in the House and Senate, and then a governor's signature. Just a couple quick things about the reasoning and the messaging around this campaign. We like to say this is the smart thing to do, and it's the right thing to do. It's the smart thing to do for some of the reasons that Peter noted at the outset, which is that our legislative process is increasingly capped to a gridlocked, caustic partisanship that is seemingly unable to make even basic decisions about how to govern the state. So if we broaden the base of particularly the primary elections, which maybe like Arizona in a lot of places, 90% of our state House and Senate seats are effectively determined in the primary. If we can broaden the base of the electorate to bring in more moderate voters, we're going to end up with better incentives for governing when folks get elected. This is the right thing to do because there's a basic issue of fairness. We spend about $75 million a year on primary elections, and every tax-paying citizen pays for those, but not everyone gets to actually take advantage of voting in those primary elections. This becomes even more acute, and this has been an important part of our messaging. When you look at the cohort of independent voters and ask yourself, well, who are these folks? One of the things that pops out at us is that half of all veterans consider themselves independent voters. So if you are unfortunate enough to be a Pennsylvania veteran, you come home from serving your country, putting your life on the line, we then lock you out of the polls, which to my mind is nearly unconscionable. We just can't do that to people who serve their country and put themselves in harm's way. So that's something on the messaging. Chris noted that we've got active bills in place, and we are increasingly confident that we're going to be able to move this forward. Part of what's gives us some confidence is that you may have noticed that Pennsylvania is maybe the biggest prize on the map in the presidential race coming up in 24. And there is a real interest among both parties in making sure that not only do we tighten up and button up the election process, but that we put all voters into play and make this a truly competitive process. So, and there's a bunch of other reasons which are I could get into, but in the interest of time, we'll just sort of leave it at that. I would encourage you, if you're interested, to look at ballotpa.org. If you're a Pennsylvania resident, you can sign our digital petition, and you can find a way. We'll find a way to get you involved in this effort, because it will only succeed if we're able to mobilize, as my Arizona colleague said, both grass tops and grassroots folks to get involved. But I appreciate the chance to share a couple updates with you. And Chris, back to you.
Okay, thank you very much. That was great. Allegra, next slide, please. Okay, mail-in voting, early voting. Controversial and very messy issues in Pennsylvania. In fact, as I'm sure you probably know, this was part of the whole 2020 brouhaha in both at the state level, but obviously spilled over into the mess at the federal level. In part, this is because there are no uniform rules on issues such as ballot curing, drop boxes, and the like across the state. It's a patchwork across counties. Rules are sometimes different in different parts of the same electoral district because those districts cut across jurisdictions. One group here in Pennsylvania, Business for America, PA, has set trying to get uniform rules through the legislature this year as a priority. Another priority that they've identified as a big problem, and it is a big problem in Pennsylvania, is pre-canvassing. That is the ability to open and count mail-in ballots before election day. It remains a big issue. There was a bill, it included in a bill last year, but the former governor, vetoed it. But this, the lack of being able to count these ballots before election day is a major source of delay. It can cause a lot of confusion. And even more importantly, the delay in counting those ballots can undermine the trust that people have in the ballot outcome or the vote outcome, because the final results can differ substantially from what's announced based on in-person voting on election day. So we really need to get this cleared up, this and other rules to have uniformity across the state of Pennsylvania. And so that hopefully will also get attention in the legislature this year ahead of the 2024 cycle. Okay, next, please. Now, ranked choice voting. Well, we still use first past the post, so ranked choice voting is not in effect here. It was introduced, however, last year in the legislature to allow ranked choice voting for municipal elections. It did not get adopted, but we still don't have that. A group called the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center actually looks at ranked choice voting in every state to see how capable the state is in terms of implementing it. And their most recent report says Pennsylvania is only preparing for ranked choice voting because only 88% of the counties have technology which is capable of implementing it. So as a practical matter, we're still away from it, at least on a statewide basis. Interestingly enough, though, the Democratic Party used it in 2022 at the end of the year to select their nominees for 3 special elections in the Pennsylvania House that were held in February. The Democrats won all 3 of these in the actual election because they were heavily Democratic districts. But interestingly, of the 3 nominating processes that used ranked choice voting, 2 of them were not resolved until the 3rd and 5th rounds, respectively. So ranked choice voting, the mechanism actually was in effect and utilized in that decision making. So Again, we don't have it. The wheels may be turning, but at this point, it's rather slowly. Next slide, please. And finally, just the last comments on the constitutional amendments. As I mentioned and David mentioned, we cannot introduce constitutional amendments through ballot measures or referendums. They have to be initiated by passing them in the legislature in two different, consecutive legislative sessions, and then put it on a ballot for voter approval. There are 9 proposed congressional amendments that have seen action in the Senate this year. Did I say 9? 6. They've seen action at least in the Senate this year. They have not been certified yet to go on the ballot, but 2 of them are election related. One would require voter ID. The other would provide for auditing of elections and election results. And I think it's obvious that the latter is connected to the problems we have with no statewide rules, no pre-canvassing, and all the questions that have arisen with respect to the validity of the vote in Pennsylvania. With that, I'll turn it over to Allegra to talk about Connecticut.
Thank you very much, Chris. And hello again. I am back to present on my home state of Connecticut. So Connecticut has a lengthy history of election debate and reform. Today, I will, hang on just a second. Today, I will be addressing the following topics: background on Connecticut voters, closed primaries, early voting, ranked choice voting, and something called the sore loser law. So as the breakdown of registered voters in Connecticut is shown in this chart containing data from the Secretary of State's website. As you can see, Democrats and Republicans make up the majority of voters, as expected, with a total of 57% of the electorate. The other category at the bottom includes registered independents and other minority parties. So what about the largest category, unaffiliated? Let's start by defining unaffiliated. So unaffiliated refers to voters who are not registered with any political party. This term is used instead of referring to these voters as independent to avoid confusion with the Independent Party, which is an established political party in Connecticut. In 2022, 41% of active voters in Connecticut, almost 1 million, were unaffiliated. According to Ballotpedia, just 17,000 people were registered as independents in 2014. In other words, registered independents make up less than 1% of active voters. So what does this mean for Connecticut? Well, Connecticut is what's known as a closed primary state, which means that only registered party members can participate in a party's primary. In 1984, Connecticut's Republican Party adopted a rule that unaffiliated voters could participate in their primaries. It was challenged by then Secretary of State, claiming it violated a 1956 state statute, allowing only party members to vote in primaries. This case went all the way to the US Supreme Court in 1986, which ruled Connecticut's closed primary law unconstitutional based on First Amendment rights of political parties to associate with whomever they want. After the ruling, the General Assembly passed legislation establishing procedures where unaffiliated voters could vote in a primary if the parties amended their rules. However, neither major party has taken up the issue. Since 41% of Connecticut voters do not identify with either major party, and they're not registered as independents, this means they are excluded from the primary process. Perhaps because so many Connecticuters do not identify with any of the registered political parties, it's unsurprising that we also suffer from extremely low turnout in primary elections. The bottom 5 states for primary turnout nationwide in 2022 were Virginia, New York, Connecticut, Delaware, and Mississippi. Each had 12% participation or less. In fact, Connecticut was also one of just 5 states that have never attained 15% turnout in midterm primaries over the past decade, the others being Louisiana, New Jersey, New York, and Virginia. New Jersey and Virginia have an excuse because they do not have state elections during the off years. Louisiana also has an excuse because of its nonpartisan system. So New York and Connecticut are both really dead last. There is a bit of good news, however, when it comes to election reform in Connecticut. In 2022, Connecticut enacted an amendment to its constitution allowing for early voting. This amendment authorizes the state legislature to provide by law for in-person early voting before an election. Until last year, Connecticut was one of 4 states that still did not permit early voting. A previous amendment allowing early voting and removing restrictions on absentee voting was defeated in 2014. However, last year, after removing the absentee provision, it passed with 60% of residents voting in favor. Legislation is currently being considered to determine the length of time early voting will be allowed, as well as allocation of funds to support it. Connecticut's new Secretary of State, Stephanie Thomas, wants 10 days of early voting, while others, including our Senator Chris Murphy, are advocating for at least 14 days. Some form of the bill is expected to pass the Connecticut State Legislature this year. Another positive trend in Connecticut is ranked choice voting, which you've already heard a lot about. Election winners in Connecticut are currently determined by a plurality vote, meaning that the candidate with the greatest number of votes wins the election, even if they did not win an outright majority of votes cast. Last year, both candidates running for governor expressed support for ranked choice voting in Connecticut. Governor Ned Lamont, who said he would submit legislation for RCV if reelected, and Bob Stefanowski, who said he was open to it. After Governor Lamont won re-election, he suggested in his inaugural address in January that ranked choice voting would, quote, take some of the sting out of politics and bring some of the decency back to public service. Since then, 3 pieces of legislation have been proposed to implement RCV in Connecticut, 2 sponsored by Democrats and 1 bipartisan bill, for a total of 27 state representatives who support it. The bipartisan bill, SB 389, an act concerning ranked choice voting, was introduced to the Connecticut State Legislature earlier this month. SB 389 focuses on ranked choice voting in local municipal elections and gives towns permission rather than a mandate to use the system. It also provides for RCV in elections for members of Congress and allows its use for presidential primaries. Connecticut Voters First, an organization in Connecticut, supports this legislation and spearheaded a campaign to provide testimony for the Government Administration and Elections Committee hearing in Hartford on March 6. While there is significant support for RCV, the biggest hurdle to passing legislation in Connecticut is implementation. According to a January 26th article about SB 389 in Connecticut News Junkie, Connecticut election officials are not equipped to implement a ranked choice voting system. Christopher Prue, president of the Registrars of Voters Association of Connecticut, said it would be impossible to carry out an election using ranked choice voting, given the aging tabulator machines used by local officials in the state's 169 municipalities. He added, the state and state legislature would need to approve brand new high-tech tabulators before that would even be possible. However, Connecticut is already planning to replace at least some of its voting machines to comply with the new early voting mandate. If this can be accomplished, then the hope is that ranked choice voting can be implemented. So I mentioned Connecticut Voters First a few minutes ago. They are a statewide organization working to implement ranked choice voting. We are fortunate today to have two of their members on our call, whom I would like to briefly introduce. The first is Javier Serra, a freshman at Harvard from Connecticut. Javi, if you're on the call, would you like to say a few words?
Hi, everyone. I'm a freshman at Harvard and I got involved with Connecticut Voters First over the past year or so, and super excited with the work we're doing in Connecticut.
Wonderful. Thank you, Javi. And now we have Mary Frances Metrick, the advisory board member of Connecticut Voters First. And after her remarks, I will return with one last anecdote about elections in Connecticut. Mary Frances?
Thank you, Allegra. Appreciate that. Shout out. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Hello?
Thank you, Allegra, and a shout out to Javi, who has been very involved and important in this effort. And as you noted, he's a Harvard student, but he's been involved since he was in high school.
I don't understand why you're calling. We're all set.
Okay, so with regard to SB 389, we, as mentioned by Allegra, there are three real elements to this, right? The presidential primary, municipal option, and then elections at the federal level for Senate and House. And the reason and at the general election time, not in the primaries, the parties determine the rules in the primaries. The reason for those three is that there's a question about whether having it for the constitutional offices and for the legislative offices require a constitutional amendment. There's also a question, of course, that would legislators be in favor of it if it did not serve their interest, if they were concerned about it. So we're hoping to introduce it in this way. Connecticut is one of two states, New York is the other, that has fusion voting. And fusion voting is the ability to vote, to have a candidate run on more than one line. So, for example, Governor Lamont in the last election ran on the Democratic line, ran on the Griebel-Frankfurt Connecticut line, and ran on the working families line. And in order to keep your line, you need to have 1% of the vote. So for parties that are not one of the major parties, it's very important that they continue to be able to tabulate voters on their lines. That makes it a little complicated to design a ranked choice voting ballot. Now, that issue does not apply at the presidential preference primary because it's a primary. It's the only primary which we're talking about having RCV in this particular legislation, and because it's the same party, there's no fusion voting issue, so that's particularly easy. For the municipalities, it's an option, and it's an option that will allow people to decide whether or not they want it in their town, and then they can work as a sort of an active study of how you would actually do fusion voting on that ballot. And we are still pursuing the federal election option as well at this time. Of course, what actually happens remains to be seen. It has to get, this legislation has to get out of the GAE, which is the Government Administration Elections Committee. That's the committee that oversees these election law changes. It has to get out of there by March 29th. So whether or not it does depends upon predominantly the preferences of the two co-chairs. One's a co-chair for the House, Representative Matt Blumenthal, and for the Connecticut Senate, it's Senator May Flexer. So the Connecticut Voters First are working closely with other aligned groups, such as Veterans for Political Innovation, Unite America, Rank the Vote, Article 4, and R Street, among others, to try to get ranked choice voting approved. It has support through the state. There's been editorials written, for example, by business owners and CEO level individuals signed up an open letter to the legislature supporting this, and there's been editorials in favor of that. Gen Z has indicated their support, signed letters, and done editorials in favor of that. And so we're just hoping that we have made a lot of progress. We have the governor's support. The governor put in a letter to the legislature at March 6th, at the March 6th hearing, indicating his support for SB 389. And we are hopeful that in 6 days, this will make it out of the GAE and onto the floor of the Connecticut Senate. Thanks, Allegra.
Thank you so much, Mary Frances. It's good to see you.
Good to see you.
So as I mentioned, there's just one last anecdote that I'd like to talk to you about. Earlier, Peter referenced something called the sore loser laws. And in 1955, Connecticut was the last state to adopt the primary party system. And it was only used if a loser wanted to challenge the choice of state convention. This may explain why Connecticut is one of only a handful of states that has yet to enact some form of the sore loser law, legislation which bars candidates who sought but failed to secure the nomination of a political party from running as independents or as nominees for another party in the general election. Here in Connecticut, a sore loser law would have ended one of the most exciting Senate races in 2006. Between the incumbent, Senator Joe Lieberman, and Ned Lamont, who would later go on to become governor. Lamont won his primary and became the Democratic nominee for Lieberman's seat. However, Connecticut election law allowed Lieberman to petition for the general election ballot in November and win re-election for a fourth term as an independent. Lieberman lost the Democratic Party support by only 4%. His centrist views ultimately won over Connecticut's largest group of voters, the unaffiliated. I will now ask Liz White to talk to us about the state of election reform in Virginia. And after she is finished, we will open the floor for Q&A. Liz, over to you.
All right, thank you all so much for having me. I'm learning so much about what's going on in other states. My name is Liz White. I'm the executive director of a group called Upvote Virginia. We launched in August of last year, but we are a new iteration of a group called One Virginia 2021, who spent the better part of last decade working for nonpartisan redistricting reform. So we know very, very well the challenges of getting legislators to willingly part with some of their power, because Virginia is another one of those states that does not have a ballot initiative. So we had to amend our constitution by getting the legislature to pass the bill, the language 2 years in a row and get it on the ballot. So I feel for all of you who are both collecting signatures and working with your legislatures. We are a nonpartisan organization, and we are part of a robust coalition in Virginia and nationally. A lot of the groups that have been named already, the League of Women Voters, Unite America, Rank the Vote, Fair Vote, et cetera, et cetera. And we work together to elevate the voices of Virginia voters and try to present solutions that are good for Virginia voters. Next slide. So our initial focus, though our mission is broader than it was last decade, we're kind of just electoral reforms in general, but our initial flagship issue is ranked choice voting. A lot of people have talked about it, and I'm going to assume that most people on the call have a pretty good understanding of it, but I will run through it really quick because it is our signature issue. And it's a simple change to the ballot that enables a better voter experience, better campaigns, and ultimately better government. It allows voters more freedom, more thorough expression of their preference, and ultimately more power, which is, as people have mentioned, why the political parties are often resistant. Instead of picking just one candidate, a voter gets their ballot and picks out their first favorite, their second favorite, their third favorite. And it is, for the voter, it is as simple as that. Next slide, please. Ranked choice voting is only used in races with more than 2 candidates on the ballot, and it only goes into effect if a candidate has not hit that 50% threshold after the first round of votes is cast. One of the reasons I think it is such a vital issue for Virginia and the nation right now is I know in Virginia, we're having more and more people step up to run for office, which shouldn't be a problem, which should be a really good thing and present a more robust conversation, a greater chance that voters will see themselves represented by someone who they have the potential to elect. But our current system, that first past the post plurality system, really is not built for crowded ballots, and it ends up leaving voters often feeling that they're not represented well at all because someone can win an election with 30%, 35%, even 40% of the vote. And in a traditional election, all we know after that is that 60, 65, 70% of voters wanted somebody else. So ranked choice voting solves that issue. Next slide, please. Again, I think you all probably know a lot of this, but just to kind of run down the long list of benefits of ranked choice voting, it does ensure a majority winner. There is none of this, someone is in a crowded race, wins 35% of the vote, and then feels like they have a mandate to rule. Or we talked to a chairperson of a local board of supervisors lately, and she said she won her first election with 40% of the vote, which is how we award winners in Virginia currently. And she said she was actually more timid in her governing style because she felt she didn't have a mandate. And that doesn't necessarily serve voters well either. So a majority winner really just gives us the information to know that this person who's been elected is the person most voters could support. The second benefit is that ranked choice voting rewards candidates who build consensus and diminishes the negative campaigning. Throwing mud at your opponent isn't going to help you if you potentially need your opponent's voters to vote for you second. If you alienate them, you're only hurting yourself and your chances of winning. It's much, much better for everyone. Again, it's smart and it's right to build a coalition, to build consensus among voters. And that involves talking to people who don't look like you, live near you, traditionally vote for you. And if and when you get elected, you also have these built-in relationships now, and you've heard the priorities and concerns of different sections of your constituency. Number three is ranked choice voting is shown to elect more non-traditional candidates. And by traditional here, I mean that most elected officials are older, more male, more white than the electorate. So this evens that playing field a little bit. It elects more candidates of color, it elects more women, it elects more first time and younger candidates. So again, it enriches that tapestry of perspectives that ends up being helpful and more representative of the electorate as a whole. Number four, it eliminates spoilers. And this I think crosses so many problems in our politics. It goes to that crowded ballot, it goes to the sore loser laws we talked about, it goes to people wanting to get in the conversation and get in the race and being told, no, you're just going to ruin this for someone else. A vote for this person might as well be a vote for your opponent. We have seen it in presidential elections. We have seen it, I'm sure, on our state and local levels, regardless of where you live. And with ranked choice voting, anyone who wants to throw their hat in the ring can do so without worrying that they're going to ultimately throw the election to someone else. In Virginia, in our Democratic primary in 2021, we literally had two Black women named Jennifer. I mean, if you want to talk about two candidates from the same demographic background, and there was a lot of concern that they would split various voting blocks. And they had to campaign, I think, a little with that in mind, instead of building a coalition and looking to represent voters that they both appealed to. It's shown to increase voter turnout. I hesitate to promise that because it is just correlation and maybe not causation, but it does make sense if you think about it. If there's a more robust ballot full of people who might actually have a chance, it's more likely that you as a voter might find someone who speaks to your priorities and speaks to your issues. And for voters, time and time again, we see from exit polls and surveys that it is easy to understand. Allegra, next slide, please. So Virginia, I believe, and one of the reasons I think our work is so important is we have a really critical role in the national conversation on this issue. A lot of electoral reforms and increasingly ranked choice voting is viewed as a progressive issue, a liberal scheme. It's, I think, having Sarah Palin lose to a Democrat in Alaska really spooked a lot of people. That was unexpected. It was a surprise to many, particularly those outside Alaska. So Virginia, as a purple state, I think has a really critical role in balancing out that narrative and showing that these reforms, ranked choice voting in particular, but electoral reforms in general, are not about party affiliation, certainly not about the parties themselves. They are about giving voters a fuller and more effective voice. Our launch event in August, we had dual headliners, and it was Governor George Allen, our former governor, former congressman, former senator, who is a Republican, and then current Congressman Don Beyer, who's a Democrat. Fun fact, Don Beyer was George Allen's lieutenant governor when George Allen was our governor. So they have a long past together, and it's not often that they're on the same side of an issue, and both spoke up for these kinds of issues. As I said, we're a purple state and can maybe course correct that national perception. One of the most important applications of ranked choice voting in the last ever in America, probably on the Republican side, was the 2021 nominating convention that Peter mentioned in the introduction. We did, as a state, nominate Glenn Youngkin, Winsome Sears, and Jason Miyares, who are our 3 statewide office holders. And for the first time in a decade, Republicans won any statewide offices, and in fact, they won all 3. I think that the GOP chose to use ranked choice voting because they knew it would give them a stronger general election candidate. They knew that there might be some more fringe options who might come in with their built-in base and get that 30% you need in a crowded field and make their way to the general election, and they would lose again. So I think they were willing to try this to see if they could course correct and get back into statewide office. And it ended up being really, really successful for them. They then used ranked choice voting in 4 out of the 11 nominating contests for congressional districts in 2022. Virginia also just has a robust business community, a robust military community, civil service with all of our DC suburbs, agriculture communities, a lot of traditionally Republican bases and sectors that I think can be brought together because none of them are being well served by a very swingy, very fringy, gridlocked, polarized legislature. Next slide, please. So my pitch to these communities in Virginia as to why their role in our role is so important. Virginia is a swing state. Our legislature is very closely divided. And in fact, our current status is that Democrats control our Senate, Republicans control our House, which meant that really not a lot got done this session. A lot of things just died in the middle. And so we have 2 states of passing legislation right now. It's either that where nothing gets through, or one party claims total control, which could happen every 2 to 4 years, and things swing way to the left or way to the right. And maybe you're happy about one or the other, but if you are a business, if you are a community, if you are someone who is trying to plan ahead based on Virginia law, that is not a good environment for you. So the fact that ranked choice voting has such enormous potential for moderating voices in the GOP, but on both sides and for everyone, I think is really an incentive for those communities to embrace ranked choice voting, to rein in their own party. But again, this is not a partisan issue. This is everyone. And even beyond where the representatives fall on the ideological spectrum, what's really important is ranked choice voting elects those consensus builders. So you might be very conservative or very liberal, but if you are someone who is showing up to seek solutions for voters, that's the kind of candidate that our CV can elect, and that's what we need as a state. Next slide. So real quick, because I know I'm probably running a little long, the status in Virginia right now, we have a local option bill. We are a little bit ahead of a lot of places who are just starting out on this, which is very exciting. It passed in 2020. It allows any city or county in Virginia to use ranked choice voting for their city council or board of supervisors elections. The only locality that has so far taken us up on our offer did dampen the head start that we were hoping to get by passing it so early. Arlington County, which is just outside DC, has adopted ranked choice voting for their county board of supervisors primaries. We are, as an organization, one of the roles we are filling is to facilitate the implementation there so that we can hold it up as this shining example of a well-executed ranked choice voting election and use that to assuage any concerns in other communities. We're looking to expand to other localities. We are hoping to, at some point, expand it on a statewide level with legislation to, we tried to pass it for presidential primaries this year. We ran into some of the same infrastructural issues that I think Allegra mentioned. And Virginia has 4 different voting system vendors. I mean, it got really wonky, but the tools just did not exist at the time to compile all of the data into a single election like it would need to do. So we might be looking at 2028 for a presidential primary, but we have a lot of other options. Virginia has elections every year, so we can talk about things like our statewide primaries, congressional primaries, legislative primaries, senatorial primaries, etc. Above the local level, Virginia is really only talking about primaries at this point. So we are not in the discussions about final 5 voting or top 2 voting. And our primaries currently, again, depends on how you define open primaries. We do not register by party in Virginia. So if the parties opt to have a primary as opposed to a convention or a caucus or a firehouse primary or something that is internal, the state runs it, but anybody can show up to their normal polling place with all of the absentee voting provisions, early voting provisions, drop boxes, and everything that come with general elections. Anyone can show up and say, I want the Republican ballot or the Democratic ballot, and they can vote in that primary, which is especially helpful because, as we've talked about, there aren't a lot of competitive races. Where I live is not a competitive area. So the primary I have the option to vote in maybe doesn't align with my personal views, but the only way I get a say in who represents me is to go vote in a party primary. Next slide, please. I just like this map from Fair Vote that shows everywhere and in all the different ways that ranked choice voting is being used. I mostly like it for that little orange dot right outside DC because that's Arlington coming up, and it's a very exciting milestone for Virginia. But I think really what this map shows is our ranked choice voting is not a one-size-fits-all application. There are lots of ways to do it, and each locality and state can decide what works for them. Next slide, please. So just to summarize what we as an organization are working on, we really do have these parallel strategies to expand local adoption of ranked choice voting through voter education and advocacy. Again, I love the pairing of the grassroots and grass tops. That is the key. We seek to pass statewide legislation for new implementation options, as I mentioned. We are facilitating the implementation of ranked choice voting in Arlington to ensure that that goes smoothly, and then just a comprehensive statewide voter education effort, because this is a relatively new conversation in Virginia. This is not something a lot of people readily have any kind of expertise in. Next slide, please. You can skip that one. Go ahead. We've talked a lot about it. And you can skip that one. This is all on our website, which I think, here we go. So if you have more questions for me or for about upvote, you can visit our website. We've got a ton of information about ranked choice voting and local efforts as well. That is my email. I mean, I'm sticking around now for questions, but you're welcome to reach out to me at any other time. Thank you all so much for having me. This has just been lovely.
Thank you very much, Liz, and thank you to all our speakers today. I know we're running a little late, but we do have a few minutes left for Q&A. And so I'm going to ask my colleague Eileen to unmute herself and start to moderate the questions.
All right. Thank you very much. We have about 6 or 7 questions, and they're not specific to states or to one of our speakers. So I'll leave it up to the speakers if you'd like to weigh in. The first question is from Mike Kennick. Is there a well-articulated counter-argument coming from Republicans who actually support ranked choice voting to respond to the Republican National Committee resolution?
I know that the chair of the Virginia GOP is a big supporter of ranked choice voting because he has seen it be effective in those statewide primaries in 2021. I don't know. I'm assuming these are behind closed doors kinds of conversations. He has not been super public about it. But I would think his argument would be that used well, applied well, especially in a primary, you do come out with a consensus candidate. Glenn Youngkin, who is our current governor, was the consensus candidate in a field of like 8. There were no negative ads put out against him with another candidate's name attached to them because that wasn't going to do them any good. He was, there was no one calling foul on the election. There were no sore losers because he had really showed that he had this broad support, and he wasn't battle worn coming out of that primary, as opposed to Terry McAuliffe from the Democratic side, who had a traditional primary where mudslinging is incentivized. And it, in a very purple state like Virginia, it was really close. And that kind of cohesion may have put him and his ticket over the edge.
No, thank you. That kind of relates to another question, and perhaps with this education about what open primaries means, but from Hamid Nabavi, was the question, how can a political party elect its candidate for the general election if people outside of the party can also participate in their open primary? So I think what we've established here is there's a very large proportion of independents who, in a closed, I live in Florida, and they recently, a couple of years ago, voted down open primaries. So it really doesn't allow parties to appeal to independents, and therefore they perhaps are not as consensus building as they might be. I didn't mean to become a panelist, but does that answer your question, Hamid? All right.
No, it didn't. And just for your information, I am not affiliated with any party, but I think a party has a right to exist, and but also is responsible for its own affairs, including running its own internal elections.
Let me
This
take
has come up in
Well,
Arizona.
can I try that? First of all voters pay for elections. It's not like the parties are paying for their own elections.
That's the
Secondly,
problem. That's the problem in my view.
well, okay. The second problem is that the parties have set the rules so that you can donate $1.8 million a year to a party or $2,800 a year to an individual independent candidate. So the rules are set in a way that the game is really rigged in favor of the parties. Now, and what has happened in reality is that in the states with closed primaries, and we are not in, just to understand, we are not in favor of completely opening primaries so people can, play games and vote, to undermine a member of another party. But we are in favor of letting independents participate in primaries because we believe, I think, as was described in Pennsylvania, that by having closed primaries, you tend to elect, each party tends to nominate the candidate most loyal to their bases, and that is primarily responsible for moderates and bipartisanship disappearing.
But that problem probably is begging for multitude of answers, not just opening primaries and disenfranchising a political party for making its own election.
In Arizona, this has come up, and where it has landed is we do want to open up our primaries completely so that there is one election that everyone participates in, and parties are absolutely free to self-organize and endorse candidates as they wish, but not at public expense.
And
I'm all for it.
And Hamid, just to, in a state, we mentioned Connecticut, in a state like Oregon, where 42% of the voters are independent and by far the largest group. In essence, what we are doing is we are completely disenfranchising those voters. Now, you may have a better solution, but right now we're looking for solutions that allow the largest group of voters to participate in the political process.
Yeah, I don't have a solution, Peter, but I am having questions about the current system and some of these solutions that are put forward.
So another question, Hamid, that you had was, why should the public fund party primary elections?
Let me chime in from the Keystone State. That's a very good question. I mean, that's, as has come up in this conversation, that's one we and others raise in states that have closed primaries. And, I have said to people, the parties can do whatever they wanted. They could have a convention, a caucus, draw names out of a hat, if they pay for them. But where we get into trouble is, as in Pennsylvania, $75 million of tax money goes to pay for primaries, and then we're locking out 1 million voters. So I think that's a question that almost answers itself.
Okay, then this isn't actually a question, but maybe a plea from Dre Samuelson. He shares that 25 states do not allow ballot initiatives, and how could we change that so that you have more options for reform than with state legislatures? So I don't know if among our panelists, if any of you were associated with states that were successful in that.
Well, Arizona has a citizens initiative process, and we have to fight to keep it because the legislature doesn't like it at all.
My guess is if you looked at, the last century, there was a huge wave of reform, maybe in the progressive era or even into the 20s, that established, particularly in relatively new states, that option. But for those of us that have, are kind of, we're there at the creation, it's a tough thing to move from a legislative state to
I can comment on the history of that. It was from about 1880 to 1920 that the 25 or so states got the initiatives and referenda in place. And it's, I see that Paul Sarno has his hand up if he would like to ask a question.
Yes, look, I'm a devoted Democrat, I support the principles of the Democratic Party, which I see as quite different from the Republican Party. Why would I want independents or Republicans voting in my party's primary, where there's a danger that they may have done so only so they could cause the nomination of a candidate who would either lose or be more reflective of their views, not mine?
Paul, I was in the middle of writing a response to you because you sent me that question, and it's a really good question. And in Virginia's system, again, where you can just show up and say, and if there's two options, you say, I want this one this time. There's very little evidence, at least in Virginia, that there's always anecdotal evidence. You know, I went in to make sure this guy didn't win. But there's very little evidence that that's ever done in large enough numbers to make a difference. I mean, people like me, where there is no party primary. There aren't even, I don't even know if there's someone running for my state Senate district in the party I usually vote for. So I'm going to go vote. I mean, kind of as you said, I'm going to go vote for the member of the other party who most closely resembles what I'd like to see in my representative. I don't know how, I mean, I think that that is a good use of my vote. The other thing that I will say is that you can only vote in one. So it's not like I can go actually have a say in the party that I belong to and go try to mess with somebody else's. But I also think it's probably a good indicator of who can win in a general election. I mean, there's the examples of like, well, it depends on, I guess, how strategic, but I think the real answer is that at least in Virginia, it never happens in large enough numbers.
I worry about special groups like the Tea Party doing such a thing just to knock out a popular Democratic candidate in many states where the Democrats don't have a majority of the voting population and are relying on independents or others to show up.
If it makes you feel better, Paul, the last example that we could find of that happening is called hilarity, when the Democrats in Massachusetts in the 2016 primary decided, instead of casting their vote for Hillary Clinton, they'd cast their votes for the governor of Arkansas, not Sarah Huckabee Sanders, but her father. And you know, to get to mess with the Republicans. However, having said that, that is in going back on 50 years of history, that's the only example I can find, and it was only a couple of thousand votes. Having said that, one of the things that nonpartisan primaries do and that ranked choice voting does is both avoid that kind of game.
That means you wouldn't have a party, you wouldn't have a primary, right?
No, in nonpartisan primaries, what happens is
anyone can vote and you rank them.
No, in nonpartisan primaries, the top two candidates move to the final election.
Or the top five.
Yeah.
You do an RCV.
Yes, as in ranked choice voting. So, for example, when Vice President Harris ran for Senate, she ran against Loretta Sanchez, another Democratic woman of color, and because they were the top two in California, and what that forced them to do is appeal to both independents and Republicans, because you know there were two Democrats running against each other, and that has, in cases where that's been used, like Washington State, California, and Nebraska, it has led to a lot of moderation and a lot more bipartisanship.
You mean the top two, no matter which primary?
There's one primary, and it's a nonpartisan primary. Okay, so
that's the way to avoid. I got it.
All right. Here's a philosophical question from Hamid. Thank you. How relevant are political parties since and there's no reference to them in the US Constitution. So,
Well-
Chime in, they're a lot less relevant than they used to
Right.
be. One of
Right.
the leading indicators is you look at how young people are choosing to register in states where they have to register for a party, and I think the number is about half of them are choosing not to register in a party. So if that's a leading indicator, and overall, you've probably seen this number. If you ask for political identification nationwide, independent is chosen by about 45% of people, and I think both Republicans and Democrats are in the high 20s or mid 20s, and they're on the decline.
And David, in Oregon, 85% of new voters are registering as independents in a state where they can't vote.
Yeah.
And there was a president of the United States who chopped down a cherry tree. I forget what his name
Right.
What's
is.
that guy's name?
But in his departing address,
yeah.
he said the greatest danger to the United States is the threat from political parties.
Yeah. Now, when I read that
And he
question,
couldn't tell a lie.
Yeah.
With that, we should perhaps at least allow some people to go. I'm admiring the tenacity and perseverance. We've got 3/4 of the people that were originally on the call are still with us. I will keep the window open if there's some more questions that Eileen wants to throw out. But I do want to thank the people that have attended. I also do want to remind them that it would be, if they want to participate in future events where we'll be talking about other states and progress on the states we've talked about, please do subscribe at reformelectionsnow.org. Eileen,
Somebody has a raised hand, Mike?
yes, Brian Shank. Would you like to unmute?
All right, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
All right, so we have this better design, I guess, of the voting system that abolishes the party primary. And so we get a 2-round system in essence, or a nonpartisan open primary. But I'm not happy with doing that for a top 2 system because it limits voters to only 2 candidates for a whole campaign season. I think that's really undemocratic. So I'd like to suggest that when we design these 2-round systems that we consider running the first round in mid-October or sometime in October. I think it's better for voters, candidates, and for parties to run it that way. I think that these open nonpartisan primaries do not really serve the purpose of nominating. They don't have a nominating function anymore. So it doesn't seem to me there's any need to hold it at the beginning of the campaign season. It would be better for everyone if we held them at the end of the campaign season. So I'd just like to ask what people think about that idea.
Well, I'd like to turn it over to Sarah, who's for the top 5 system, which is a very interesting system, and let Sarah explain why she's for that. Is that okay, Sarah?
Yeah. I follow your logic, and I'm not sure I don't agree with you, but this is such a heavy lift to get open nonpartisan primaries with ranked choice voting in the general that we are staying highly focused. Like, we're afraid that if we throw in every reform we can think of that's going to make a more perfect system, that we might actually handicap ourselves in getting anything at all. So we're focused on open nonpartisan primaries. Frankly, it's a system very much like what Alaska instituted. And what you saw was there was a lot of primary candidates. I think it was like 48 or something. And Mary Peltola, who was an eventual winner, only came out of the primary with 6% of the vote. But once she was there and she was able to earn some media, she's not a woman of great means. She was actually able to make her positions well known, and she was civilized. And I mean, it really was, again, it's anecdotal. It's an N of 1. It's now, well, actually, they've had 2 elections using the system, but it has worked as advertised. And so we have decided we haven't gotten into it on this call, but there's a number of ways you can actually implement ranked choice voting. And some of them are better than others. But again, for the sake of practicality and increasing the probability that we can be successful, we've gone with what we think is the simplest method to explain, which is what Liz went over earlier, and what probably everybody's familiar with, where the candidate with the least first place votes gets eliminated first and votes reallocated, et cetera. So
I'd like to say though, in a quick response to that, that Joe Kirby in South Dakota doesn't have that option. So they just made ranked choice voting illegal. And the very strict single subject rule in South Dakota makes it very hard for him to get two things like that enacted at the same time. So he's going for a top two system. And in situations like that, I'd rather see Joe Kirby propose using the first round in October. I think it'd be a lot better. Certainly, if you're running 5 candidates or something, it might be better. It's not so bad.
I think Brian and others, it's one of the advantages of our American political system is that we have 50 states in which we can experiment with variations. And in fact, I think we do have to tailor what we go after practically by state. And I think that's something that was clear in this evening's presentations. And I think it's something we're going to be watching and understanding better as we see how these experiments work out. But one thing is for sure is we do need to do some of these things because what's in place today is not working very well. Again, I thank everyone for coming tonight. I think I'm going to let some of the people that are on the later time zones be excused for dinner. And I appreciate everyone that was able to participate and make this such an interesting call. Thank you.
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you.
Can we get copies of the slides?
Yeah,
They'll be on the website within a few days, and we also have a recording of the entire event if anyone wants to link into that.
Thank you.
Any other questions? I'll leave the window open just a couple minutes more in case somebody wants to check the chat and make sure we've picked up all the.
That was pretty much, there was a participant, Sazerzi, who had similar questions about public funding that had to leave the call, but.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
You too.
Thank you.